Our next panel, right? And so, as one of the things that we've talked about specifically at C3 Solutions, and hopefully you've gotten a copy of it already, you probably couldn't sit in your chair without sitting on a flyer promoting our Free Economies, our Clean Economies report. And so the next discussion is actually going to be moderated by myself with a couple of colleagues, and I'll move this over here in doing so. I'll sit next to you guys here. So, there we go. So, again, my name is Drew Bond. I'm the president and CEO of C3 Solutions. Thank you. Thank you so much. And the topic of this panel is on a report that we issued, and I would encourage you to read it. It is something that we believe in extremely in terms of the importance of economic freedom to the environment. And so in this report, we actually took two indices, one from the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which they've done for almost 27, I think, years, and also the Yale Environmental Performance Index. And so I'll let these gentlemen talk about the results of that report. But let me first introduce them, if I may. So to my far left is Anthony Kim. Anthony gratefully flew here from New York last night and got in very late, so I appreciate your going to extreme lengths to be with us today. So Anthony heads up the Index of Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation and is also part of the Thatcher Center and comes with many years of experience. I think you've been at Heritage for how many years now? 18, 20? 20 years. 20 years. So Anthony comes at this with quite a bit of experience in terms of the conservative free market movement. And then Nick Loris, who is currently the Vice President of Public Policy at C3 Solutions, actually wrote the report. And so he wrote it while he was at Heritage, and so we're grateful for that. We're grateful for the Heritage Foundation's willingness to lend Nick's pen and mine to this discussion. And Nick comes at this with a number of years of experience, having been an economist and served at the Heritage Foundation for over 12 years. And so with that, let me just offer a quick question, and maybe Anthony, since the Index of Economic Freedom is really the foundation of this report, can you tell us about the Index of Economic Freedom? What is it, and why has it been so important to the Heritage Foundation all these years?
Sure. Thank you, Drew. I'm delighted to be here with you all. Allow me to take a half step back.
Yes.
Yeah, this is actually better. I like to stand up.
Yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth, not only for this, but wonderful introduction and setting. Without you, how can we do this? So thank you so very much. And Dr. Fox, once again, I'm very delighted to see you, and especially with that speech. I mean, to me, you're a very unique policymaker. You have a medical degree, so you know about public health. You're defense minister for UK, so you know something about security. And you were trade minister, so you know about trade and investment. So to deal with the climate change issue practically and effectively, we not only need a good speech, but we need a practical experience. Public health, security, and trade. So thank you so much for setting the stage for all of us. Now, again, allow me to take a half step. I'll get to the nuts and bolts of the Index of Economic Freedom. That's what I do. But, you know, when I was flying over here, I was thinking about where I'm going and why I'm going and why it matters to all of us. 12 years ago, 2009, that was when they got together to talk about environmental issues. So one before COP26 was Denmark conference, Copenhagen, Denmark. That was 2009, right after global financial crisis, 2008, global financial economic crisis. Bush to Obama. 12 years later today, very similar setting. Right before this COP26, we had a global crisis. This time, China generated public health global crisis, and now we're here. Obama 2, basically, President Biden, right? And then Republican president to Democratic president. The setting, what I'm saying, is very, very similar, and the issue is also very, very similar. What didn't change is the fundamental solution we have to sharpen up and advance. I'm talking about free market capitalism, solution-based, evidence-based. People talk about, let's talk about science, evidence-based discussion. Then why are they ignoring economics? Last time I checked, economics is a social science. Let's talk about science, let's talk about what works. And I think that's why here, in these intervening 12 years, if you ask me, well, free market system, unfair, not just, it's for the rich. But let's be honest, this is time for not just resetting. I don't like talking about resetting capitalism and our system. Some people the other day in Glasgow, they talked about uprooting the system. Oh my goodness, what are they talking about? I think this is time for us recharge free market system, capitalism. I mean, you all have iPhone, right? Without capitalism, we cannot enjoy this iPhone. And we gotta talk about how to recharge our system, not resetting. Resetting means something wrong with it. So people say, let's reimagine, let's reset. But I think this is time to recharge our system so that we can continuously advance what's good for the human being. And that's why I think we are here. One more thing. People talk about ESG. Now people talk about not only at company level, but for the countries. Well, if you look at environmental issue, social issue, governance issue, key words to those issues is freedom. If you care about ESG, why are you investing in China? Tell me. Why? Environmental problem, social problem, governance problem. This morning I checked, China is still run by CCP. Am I wrong? My simple problem with China is very simple. Its official name is People's Republic of China. China is neither republic nor peoples. Anyways, my point is, when we talk about climate change, I think this is really an opportunity to talk about climate for freedom, climate for economic freedom, climate for political freedom, and climate for greater prosperity all together. G20 meeting right before COP26, they said PPP, people, planet, prosperity. Without freedom, how can we get there? How can we come up with the policies that can work for people, planet, prosperity without freedom? So, the Heritage Foundation, now I'm getting into a bit of details. Back in 1995, we kind of knew the importance of what works, right? So, without any agenda, political agenda as a think tank, we put together a few policy variables to see why this country is doing better than the other. So we put together an index. Back in those days, people were thinking, what's index? What are you doing with this? What are you trying to say? But it's plain and simple. If you have a rule of law, open market, regulatory efficiency, and limited government, good things can come through. Good things can happen continuously. So what we are advocating is a transparency, openness, accountability in terms of making economic policies. And we've been doing this index since 1995. And I'm delighted now, without any sort of the prejudice, people are talking about the importance of openness and transparency and accountability. So this is a one tool we like to continuously advance in terms of many different discussions, environment, social, and governance once again. So I did a quick correlation between ESG variables and economic freedom, our index basically. Very high correlation. So I think something's there, just in case you didn't realize. Freedom matters, and really without freedom, we cannot get anywhere.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. So Nick, give us a little bit of background in terms of your thinking on putting these two indices together. Why did you choose the Yale Environmental Performance Index, for instance, and a little overview in terms of what you thought you would find before you started, and what did you find after you started, after you finished?
And unlike Anthony, I'll actually just answer your question. It's a good question. There's a lot of indices out there. The Fraser Institute in Canada has a very good economic freedom index. There's the International Property Rights Index. Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, has a climate resiliency index. And honestly, I'd like to use them all. I think there's a lot of interesting data out there to look at these correlations that exist out there. I chose Heritage's Index of Economic Freedom, one, because I'm familiar with it, having worked there for about 12 years. But I really appreciated the sub-indices within the index. So talking about private property rights, talking about open markets, trade freedom, regulatory certainty, the rule of law. All of these things, when I studied economics, were critically important to me. And I came to learn about the Index of Economic Freedom at grad school, actually, when I was at George Mason University. And unsurprisingly, there's a strong correlation between economic freedom and all of the metrics that we like as people, whether it's life expectancy, whether it's food security, economic well-being, and prosperity. And so if you look at the correlation between the Yale Environmental Performance Index, there's 32 metrics of environmental performance that Yale does, everything from waste management to CO2 emissions to water resources. And so it's a very comprehensive data set. And when we take statistics, we all know that correlation is not causality. And so this is a very simple rudimentary analysis, but I do think it provides the right framework and the right metrics by which we should be judging policy, because these metrics, whether does something increase or decrease energy freedom, does it increase or decrease private property rights, they tend to yield higher scores when those scores of private property rights or tax freedom go up. And so what I would hope is when members of Congress or members of Parliament are thinking about environmental policies, they're looking at these underlying metrics of economic freedom and gauging whether or not it's going to yield higher results in terms of economic progress, but also environmental performance. Because I think people care increasingly about climate change, but what we've seen is that people are not willing to pay all that much for climate change. Polls in the United States show that most people are not willing to pay an additional $10 US per month on their electricity bill to fight climate change. And to Dr. Fox's point, that's why we need to lower the cost of alternatives, not increase the cost of conventional fuels. And I think the principles rooted in free enterprise and economic freedom get us there.
Yeah, thank you.
If I may, just quick footnote, sure. Technical footnotes. Obviously, this is not a political exercise, right? This is really economic exercise when we do correlation between Heritage Index and Yale Index. To be precise, Yale's environmental index is called Environmental Performance Index. And we correlate economic freedom with the environmental performance. So not surprisingly, open, free economies, they perform better. Luxembourg's performing far better than China. Germany is better than China, so you know why. So my point is that this is not a political intellectual exercise. This is really a science-based intellectual exercise. And the left cannot argue that this is a right-wing agenda. No, if you correlate freedom with what United Nations produce, we have a similar outcome. One more footnote. Not only Yale nowadays, since we're talking about this in the university, MIT, they have a new index, something called Green Future Index. They did that index early this year, January. Out of curiosity, because I'm known as an index man, I correlated Economic Freedom Index and Green Future Index. No wonder high correlation. Greater freedom means greater green future.
Yeah, so that actually leads me to my next question, Anthony, which is, in terms of economic freedom, I mean, we talk about it a lot, certainly among friends, but I noticed that when I talk to friends on the left, or folks that just simply haven't, frankly, heard free markets in good context lately, there seems to be confusion in terms of what I mean by economic freedom and perhaps what they mean or think they mean by economic freedom. In other words, there seems to be this idea that free markets means no government. or that economic freedom means no government. And I know that's not what you're saying. I know that's not what the index indicates. So I'm just kind of curious, help us understand, what do you mean by limited government, and what are some good examples of those countries that rise to the top?
That's actually a very good fitting question, because obviously when we talk about freedom, we are not talking about the absence of government. I mean, that will be completely low risk in anarchy. We need a government, but government, they can deliver service. You know, the best service sector is actually, should be the government, public. They are there to serve the people, but nowadays we see the other way around. They want to be served by people, and they want to activate a few people, and ultimately they want to use as their proxies. I think that's the fundamental problem we are getting into. But in our index, we do recognize the important role of the government, and we hope it can be smart, fat-free in terms of spending, not greedy. So any social contract, let's talk about European nation, let's say France. Fine if they want to spend more than half of their GDP in terms of very generous social benefit here and there. I respect that, because that's the social contract between the public sector and the citizens of France and in France. But we cannot say that model is really great. We cannot really say Singapore is great because it has less than 20% of public spending. But it's a small city economies, and then they do have their own social contract in terms of their cultural and other societal issue. What we are arguing is there's an undeniable general pattern and trend, limited, spending money but wisely when necessary, like defense, upholding rule of law, and other areas. We do need the government role. But nowadays, as you can see, in the name of rescuing the economy, revitalizing the economy, and even changing the system, if they start spending more money, it's not only good in terms of fiscal sense, but ultimately you are making people more dependent on programs, and we are not being innovative, and we are not being entrepreneurial, and we become more political because people just need free money. So, coming back to our index, what we are arguing is really kind of smart and, again, responsible government. That's what we are talking about when we say limited.
Yeah, that's great. Responsible government, I like that.
Yeah,
go
if I
ahead,
could
Nick.
just, in the context of the environment, I think it's important to think through a few things. One is that private property rights, which again are essential to environmental performance, are only as good as the institutions that protect them. And so you need strong institutions to protect private property rights. And secondly, we know that private markets produce externalities and social costs. There's environmental pollution, and we should look to internalize those externalities. And that can be through a government policy. I think what gets lost in that conversation sometimes is, one, what's the best government policy? You can think through regulations or a cap and trade permitting system or a tax of some sort, but the existence of an externality itself doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be internalized either, that there's diminishing marginal returns as you ratchet down environmental pollutions too, where costs may significantly outweigh the benefits. And so government certainly has a proper place in helping to internalize these externalities that the private market produces, and they may not be socially captured in a price or a regulation, but there needs to be a transparent cost-benefit analysis proceeding through these regulations.
Yeah, so without losing track of time too much, I want to make sure we get to, so what's the punchline? Tell us, Nick, in terms of economic freedom and environmental performance. I mean, what did you find when you did the correlation?
Yeah, if you look at then if you have the report or see the report, there's a couple just bar charts that show that free economies are twice as clean as mostly unfree economies, which again is not all that surprising. And I think one of the critical elements that we talk about in the paper is the environmental Kuznets curve, which is this inverted U-shaped curve in which you have GDP on the horizontal axis and then environmental pollution on the vertical axis. And as countries are freer, they become wealthier. They are going to have some sort of environmental byproducts as they industrialize. but having that wealth gives them the means to reduce that pollution. And so the wealth equals health argument also applies to environmental well-being. And I think for the purposes of this report is we want to kind of shift the environmental Kuznets curve to the left and down as much as possible, so it's in these countries' self-interest to grow as quickly as possible, but then have the means to reduce those emissions, whether it's kind of your traditional criterion pollutants like particulate matter, but also with CO2 emissions as well. And so again, if you look at kind of all of these sub-indices, you can break down correlations between private property rights and environmental performance, between open markets and environmental performance, and I think that now especially is critical, with this growth of conservative nationalism and the populist movement. I think that there's been, and supply chain concerns, there's this knee-jerk reaction that it's been globalizations, it's been open markets that's caused this problem, and we need more self-sufficiency. And I think that's going to lead us in the opposite direction. We need more open markets, we need more trade freedom and investment freedom. I think that's ultimately going to help the deployment of more clean energy technologies, help decarbonization, and help spread the deployment of low carbon and emissions-free technologies to some of these developing countries who are still going to be rising on that environmental Kuznets curve.
Yeah, I think that's, so I'm so interested in this environmental Kuznets curve. I mean, you just say it and you sound smart, right? Because it's made for and by economists, but as I understand it, again, it's basically, as you point out in your report, this curve that as countries, and I'll say people, right? But so people make up countries. As countries become more economically prosperous, they eventually, so there will be some increase in carbon emissions, for instance, right? Because people want they want air conditioning, they want cars, they want all the things that come with modern conveniences in terms of prosperity. So to Dr. Fox's point, it's not a degrowth argument, but it's the argument that people clearly want to rise up the economic ladder and become more prosperous, and in doing so, they have the opportunity then to, in fact, reduce their impact on the environment as they get more prosperous. Is that
Yeah, that's correct.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And we know that environmental protection, from an economics 101 perspective, it's a luxury good, and so you get more environmental benefits when you have the means and the wealth to actually reduce those emissions and pollutants. And where a country may be on the environmental Kuznets curve and which pollutant may differ from country to country, from pollutant to pollutant, but there's been some good analysis. There's a Danish study that I point to in the study that looked at the environmental Kuznets curve using carbon dioxide as the metric and finds it holds true. And so I think that's an encouraging sign as we contemplate and debate this idea of degrowthism versus decoupling. And I think decoupling is ultimately the way you want to get, where there's a number of countries, mostly the ones that are free and economically free in the Index of Economic Freedom, that have actually decoupled their emissions. There's an analysis from Carbon Brief that looked at 32 different countries who are showing an increase in GDP and a decrease in CO2 emissions. And I think that's ultimately what we want to get to. And again, it's those policies, I believe, rooted in economic freedom that will help the developing countries and some of those countries that are either mostly unfree and certainly repressed, help them get there faster.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point lost often is to the the discussion about the degrowth movement, or even the fact that okay, so the industrialized free economies have actually there's an argument that says on the left, right, that the free economies have basically developed this problem, and therefore they're the ones that should ratchet back their economies because of that, right, and that somehow that's going to help the developing world. And I think, as Dr. Fox made the point, in fact, if you want to help the developing world, we need to actually export not only innovation, but export democracy and freedom. So, Anthony, if I've got that right, I'm curious to know, as you think about the countries that rise to the top and maybe some countries that are lower performers, can you give us some examples of what are some good lessons learned there? Who are those countries?
Sure, Drew. We've been talking about like a big picture, like a macro level, the relationship between freedom and environmental performance and why freedom matters, but allow me to get down to micro level. To me, this is really about process. Freedom does not automatically generate good things. Freedom generates a lot of good intermediary steps, processes, micro process, innovation, and capacity to make society transparent, accountable, and all that. So I think ultimately what we need to talk about is really capacity building process. And if you look at China as an example, they may be opening up, but because of their governance system, their capacity politically, economically, and socially, it's not really up to the standard in terms of participating even this kind of climate conference, committing themselves to the certain goals, if goals need to be committed. So we're really talking about capacity. Look at Taiwan. It's another kind of, same culture, same geography. But if you look at Taiwan, it's a much smaller compared to China mainland. But in terms of their capacity, it's really amazing. The technology and openness and governance, political system, not only economic system, but the political system, as you mentioned, democracy. These are really important intermediary steps and ingredients to make freedom work and to transform what's unfree to free. We need these key ingredients. Again, transparency, accountability, trust, and good public service, not big, unlimited public service. We need very timely, smart public service from the officials. And we need to think about how to advance these healthy, constructive, forward-looking discussions, not just complaining. We have too many activists in my mind. We need doers who can really advance ideas. One last point on this issue. I think we need 3 I's: ideas, individuals, and institutions, where we can put together all these 3 I's in the context of solving climate challenges.
Yeah. Can I add one I? Innovation.
Innovation.
But I think all of those things would actually help. So Nick, we've got just 5 minutes left. I would love to hear a couple of examples of, just who are the top performers and why do you think that is, and who are the least performers. And I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me and we say over and over again is just the fact that when you look at the countries that are mostly free versus the countries that are mostly unfree, you see that the countries that are mostly free are actually clean by a factor of 2. So they're twice as clean, which is really amazing. And so, but give us some examples if you would.
Yeah, and probably you can think through who they might be. If you look at a country like Denmark or Australia or Canada, and one of the things that strikes me about them and kind of the modern time of wanting to decarbonize as quickly as possible, and a common thread is that they all have high scores on regulatory efficiency. And so many of, I think, the problems with decarbonization in the United States and even in Europe, you hear wind and solar companies lamenting the long regulatory processes that it takes to license and permit everything from a solar array to a wind farm to a small modular reactor. These projects just kind of get held up in this regulatory paralysis, and if it's not the regulatory permitting process, it's NIMBYism or active litigants who want to essentially block everything through excessive litigation. And so some of these countries who have open regulatory environments surely care about making sure that environmental metrics are met through building a new mine or a new solar project, but they're actually doing it with some sort of expediency and efficiency while maintaining environmental protection. And then on the flip side, you have your Venezuelas of the world, you have your Chinas of the world, where a lot of the assets are not privately owned, and so any revenues such as from Venezuela that were sold in oil would be dumped into social programs rather than cleaning up the environment. And you look at Venezuela, who used to be one of the most economically free countries in the world, is just a severe, extreme cautionary tale for what can happen now, because the environmental degradation as a result of the government ownership of all these assets and how they've spent the proceeds from their oil revenues has just been economically and environmentally disastrous.
Yeah, that was striking to me, that in your example about Venezuela, in just 50 years, Venezuela went from becoming, well, they were the top economic performer, right? And now they're the worst economic performer. And to your point, look at the impact on the environment. So we have 1 minute left. I wonder if there's any questions in the audience for these gentlemen. I see someone who's very interested in raising her hand. Yes, would you please identify yourself, and should we give you a mic?
Economics Center, and I'm very religious today.
Yeah. Do we need it? Yeah.
You mentioned, Drew, that rising up the economic ladder is important, but people don't get it, that they will never ever rise up the economic ladder if they live on government handouts. And that's the problem that we see, at least in Europe. Continental Europe is the worst, I think, and the US after Obama has had the same issues. How can we change that? Because Dr. Fox mentioned capitalism. Capitalism is actually the precondition for economic freedom and prosperity. But people don't understand the economic principles. So shan't we go one step back and educate them also in economics, and that one and one makes two, and we don't have a zero-sum game?
Yeah.
If I may, really important question in terms of how and where do we go from here? And I think that we don't need to take a full step back, perhaps half step back. I think what we need all together, we need a better communication. We need a more strategic, effective communication. Well, I'm losing my communication right here. Like as Dr. Fox mentioned, let's talk about very sensible, common sense stuff, not just feel good, whatever political agenda. I think we've been unknowingly, perhaps willingly by some politicians, we become dependent on political rhetorics and whatever feel good agenda. You know, hope and change, fine with it, but let's be practical and innovative and real so that we can spread opportunities for us, for our next generation, so that we can really onward and upward. We're going to move forward, not move backward. So in my view, if I may, Barbara, wonderful question. It's not going to be an overnight process. You and I, we know. You've been doing this for long years. Things are unfortunately getting worse. I think this is time for us really a bit more strategically. We can be, in this part, we can be activists. We got to activate our strategic communication.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I know we need to wrap up, so I'll try to put a bow on that if I can. I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important that free market thinking people get involved in this issue of climate change. And I think that's why C3 Solutions decided to be here, and why it's important that we're here during this COP26 meeting, is because climate change has become a proxy war over capitalism. And so we have to engage on this issue, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of, well, maybe you're still skeptical about the science, or maybe you're still skeptical about the projections 50 or 100 years from now. Maybe you're more alarmist, and in fact, you think we have far less time. Wherever you are on that spectrum, fundamentally, it's going to be innovation that's needed. And if we want innovation, then look at the data, look at the economics, look at the math, look at the history. It's free markets, it's capitalism that's going to produce innovation faster and accelerated more than anything else. So with that, let me just say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for my guests up here.